Thank you. Good morning. American cities have been amazing places throughout this country's history. Concentration of capital of all kinds that makes fortunes, drives the culture, sends sparks flying outward in politics, education, entertainment. The cities throw up glittering skylines, pull in money and brawn and talent, and send wealth, ideas, and goods out into the country. But they have a mixed record for African Americans. After decades of struggle brought legal guarantees for full citizenship, access to housing markets, protections in law for educational access, and fair employment, America's cities have indeed incubated black talent, created fortunes, and generations of leaders in a variety of fields. And yet, the cities have also been places of intense disappointment, barriers, setbacks, broadly speaking, structural impediments to black aspiration. A disproportionate number of black families have zero net worth. That is, if you add up their assets and add up their debts, the number is zero or below. Too many families have never been able to use real estate as the basis of family wealth. Even as black students earn high school diplomas, 2-year and 4-year degrees at new, higher levels, whites, even with less education, are able to earn more in a weekly check and build wealth more reliably. And I'm not talking about a gap of 10 or 20 or 30%, but accumulated wealth that means that white families have 12 and 18 and 20 times as much net worth. Gaps that existed in the 1950s and 60s at the time of the end of legal Jim Crow still exist today. Why? Will it always be so? How can cities like Memphis push back against this country's history and their own history? Terri and Charles Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote in the Atlantic's blockbuster article, The Case for Reparations, how structural racism has shut African Americans out from building wealth. How does Memphis fit into this story? Professor, let's start with you.
Well, I think Coates, one of the things that I get from that article is we have to be careful not to be tricked by history.
You're going to have to tell us what you mean by that.
What I mean is, when I'm thinking about Faulkner, right? The past is not the past, right? It's still with us. So when we talk about legacies, when we talk about history, we're also talking about the now, right? In the 1930s and 40s, the leading barrier for African Americans in the United States was segregation. In April of 2019, the leading barriers for black folk in Memphis, Tennessee is segregation, right? That answer has not changed, right? So it's really important for us to be able to come to a place where we can tell the truth about the barriers and challenges that African Americans in particular and other folks or other working folks are facing, so that we can actually confront the issue, so that we can actually create and craft viable solutions to the issues that we face, to the issues that you laid out.
But when you say segregation is still the challenge, I mean, you could teach a whole semester on it or write a book on it, but how is segregation different from what it was in the days of enforceable covenants, of lines that everybody understood where people could and could not go?
Right, segregation has shifted, right? So we don't have signs on buildings anymore, but we still have redlining, right? There's a great article that just came out about redlining in Memphis, right? And so a map from the 1950s is indistinguishable from a map of now when it comes to rates of home ownership, right? So we can talk about change over time. We historians love to do that, but we do that. I think we do that a little bit too much, right? We tend to want to run victory laps about the fact that we grew the black middle class, and we did. We've grown the black middle class over the last 50 years by a factor of about 8, right? But the rate of poverty in African American communities is virtually unchanged, right? So we can talk about all the ways in which we've moved forward, but in housing, access to health care, education, right? All of the major indices that you laid out and that Coates is really articulate about laying out, all of those major indices, right? We see these titanic racial gaps, right? So for me as a historian, I say, what did we do back in the 1950s and 1960s in order to confront these. And I saw that as a three-tiered process, right? One, you had an active role of the federal government, right? A civil society that was actively engaged in confronting segregation, right? And a political process powered by individuals, powered by communities, right? Who were very politically engaged in transforming their communities, their states, and their nation. So you had these pieces that were working, right? And even there, you still faced, serious headwinds, strong headwinds. So, I think we've got a recipe, we've got a template for how to move forward. The challenge for us is to reconstruct that template in a contemporary moment so that we can see the sorts of changes that we'd like to see.
Terri Freeman, you're the president of this museum. The reason this museum is here is because 51 years ago there was a sanitation workers' strike, and Dr. King came to be with the sanitation workers, but they were earning, it sounds a little hyperbolic, but they were earning starvation wages on which a full-time working man could not support a family. Are there echoes of that in today's Memphis?
I think so. I think that evidence shows us that poverty here is significantly higher than in many parts of the country. Last year we commissioned a survey. Dr. Della Vega, who I think is going to be on program a little later, looked at poverty over the past 50 years then. And what we found was, well, yes, there was growth. Absolutely there was growth. But over 50 years, African Americans still made 50% of what whites made in this community. And we looked at Shelby County, and that was steady. So there was steady growth, but 50%. Still, in 50 years, there's a problem there. And so I think, from my vantage point, when I look at wages in the city, I think we focus a lot on wage. I don't know that we focus enough on jobs that have some progression, because you talked about middle class and generating a middle class. One of the things that we're not doing very well is generating a middle class. So I think in addition to wage, we have to look at jobs that actually provide some growth, some option for movement in this society, right? So that people not only are insured a wage today, but that there's growth potential in that wage. And I think that that's where this wealth gap extends from, has to do with land ownership, property ownership, and the jobs that actually have any growth potential.
And this is a great example of the headwinds that we're facing in Memphis, because I think that's a great idea. There's a critical mass of folks who employ people in Memphis who have no interest whatsoever in creating those types of jobs. Right? We sell ourselves for our ability to pay people slave wages so they can make lots of great things for middle-class people, right? That's one of our selling points in Memphis, right? Is come to Memphis, you can pay your employees really low wages, right? And your corporation and your company can make lots and lots of money. So that's the headwinds that we have to name, right? The reason we can't create living wage jobs, the reason 43% of the people in town making less than $15 an hour, because there's a massive financial and economic incentive not to do that, right? Poverty makes a lot of people a lot of money. Poverty Incorporated, right? A lot of folks make a lot of money not selling houses to single family homes. If I can make more money selling houses to investors than individuals, well, clearly that's what I'm going to do, right? So again, we have to be able to name the names, right? Name the obstacles and the headwinds that we're trying to face so that we can confront them.
But if you name the social systems that perpetuate poverty, isn't there a risk in that? When Amazon was enticed to come to New York, there was a couple of weeks of backlash, and then they left. If you name it too loud, people say, I'm going to go someplace where there's less static, less pushback, and less PR problem. And then you get no jobs instead of bad jobs. I'm not saying it's an easy solution to figure out.
I guess the question then I would ask is, are we willing to continue with the status quo Is it not worth, in some instances, pushing back? I mean, one of the things that comes to mind, you talk about headwinds, is even if you can find employment that leads to growth and a higher wage, you might not be able to get there here in Memphis. There is no effective public transportation that can get people from one point to another. And that's a significant contributor to ensuring that you keep folks in a certain place.
Right. Malcolm X once said, a poor individual grows up in a poor neighborhood. You grow up in a poor neighborhood, you go to a poor school. Go to a poor school, you get a poor education. You get a poor education, you get a low-paying job. And the cycle repeats, right? So in the same time that Memphis is actively disregarding the lived experience of a literal majority of its citizens, actively disregarding the life and well-being of a majority of its citizens, Memphis is also running around talking about how awesome Memphis is, right? You know, we are great at, you know, hey, 901, there's all this magical unicorn-like stuff going on here for, you know, if you are, you know, again, if you're middle class and, you know, if your mom and dad can front your bills or whatever, right? So, and those two things they run on parallel tracks here. Right? So on the one hand, Memphis is heavily invested in bringing new people and talking about and has an image of itself as a vibrant city. For whom? Right? And then at the same time, Memphis is perfectly content in many segments of our society, is content to remain in this particular status quo. You can't have it both ways. Right? Other cities say, you know what, we love the disarray that goes on in Memphis. So then folks can come on to Nashville. Right? Come on to Atlanta, come on to Mobile, come on to Birmingham. Because look, you know, if you go to Memphis, well, you know, you're probably going to have to send your kid to a private school because you probably won't be all that content with the public school system in Memphis. This is an argument that other cities are making about our city, and yet, right? We don't see the city making any sorts of major investments or any investment, as last time I checked, in the public school system. Right? I think the city's commitment to public schools was zero. The last time, unless that's changed, then someone can fix that later, right? But you know, so we can't say we're invested in communities and people, and we want to move forward, and we want to build a workforce ready for the 21st century, right. And at the same time have a school system where, you know, our graduates graduate from the school system, and 30% of them need remedial courses once they get to college. You can't have it both ways.
And I think that you have to ask the question, going back to what Charles said earlier, is how invested is the city in the school system if, in fact, you are selling the fact that you have a low-wage community right. of workers, right? And if you educate folks, they're probably likely not to stay in those right. jobs, right?
Right.
So I think that these are truly some structural issues, big issues that, as Charles said, have to be called out, and then we have to figure out what we're going to do about it.
Right. One of the real challenges is that if you educate them to a high standard, in many cases they'll leave.
They'll move,
because
right.
there's a lack of opportunity right where they are, which is, I mean, that's just maddening. If you say, we've got to fix the education, you fix the education, but in search of opportunity, because the horizon here is so narrow, people go elsewhere to make their fortunes.
I've got a friend of mine, Mecca Agwekwe, shout out to Code Crew. I don't know if Mecca is here. Mecca is trying to get legislation passed on the state level, so requiring high schools to teach a computer science class. Mm-hmm. It's 2019.
Right.
Our high schools don't teach computer science classes, right? Computer science classes are taught in Arkansas, right? They're taught in South Carolina, right? I think they're taught in Mississippi, but we don't teach computer science. But we're not required to teach computer science classes in the state of Tennessee in 2019. Rumor has it, computers are kind of a big thing. Maybe.
I've heard.
It's a rumor. I mean, this internet thing might really take off, right? I mean, there might be some people at some point, you know, this thing might generate jobs, right? So, you know, but in the state of Tennessee, maybe we'll teach computer science, maybe we don't, right? So that's an example, again, of on the one hand, saying we want people to come here to get jobs and to raise families here, right? But on the other hand, you know,
Terri Freeman, let's nationalize it a little bit, because the post-war black neighborhood has, in too many places, at too many times, been a place where if you buy a house, if you were on the front end of ethnic succession, you paid a premium for that house. And then by the time you sold, its value was bashed down or failed to grow at all, even over the course of a long mortgage. If you buy a house here today, if you buy a house on the south or west side of Chicago, if you buy a house in East New York, in Brooklyn, are black families able to take advantage of home ownership as an escalator up the way white families have?
I don't think so, and I think that's historic. I think that historically, we've not had the options around home ownership that many white families have had. We haven't had the inducements to buy that many white families have, and when we do buy, as you say, in our neighborhoods, values don't go up as they do with the rest of communities. That's even been shown that even if you buy in a suburb, and it's majority black, the value of the homes is less than it is in a community that is majority white. Doesn't matter if there's not even a difference in educational level.
Or the houses.
Value, or the houses.
Right.
So no, we haven't been able to take advantage of that. And then if you do have historic neighborhoods where African Americans were middle class, they bought the home, mom was raised in the home, and then the next generation comes up in the home. Now, grandma can no longer afford the taxes, right? So grandma loses her home, and then what happens? We begin to see homes being purchased for little or nothing by people who don't look like me. Just as an aside, I think that in too many of the communities that you name, the level of gentrification that has occurred has wholesale wiped out people from the neighborhoods that they called home.
And wasn't there some payday before that happened for people who were able to own their homes?
Well, I mean, the level of payday is a question, right? I mean, the level of what some of those homes, so say you owned a home, let's take Washington, D.C., since we had this conversation.
I don't want to leave it all in the green room, right? So I'm glad you...
I'm just coming back from the D.C. Baltimore area yesterday, and it was an interesting weekend, as I am a Howard graduate, and there is a HU. There's a issue at Howard where one new resident suggested that if the university doesn't want to, play by DC rules, that they should move. Now, last I checked, Howard was founded in 1867, 68.
67.
They're not moving, okay? They ain't going nowhere, right?
No.
But this idea...
Push off, colonizer. Push off.
But the idea that here's a neighborhood all around this historically black college and university that has changed significantly. And in fact, the person who sold, if they sold their brownstone, that's a if it wasn't taken because of taxes, what they got in comparison to what his name is hashtag gentrification George or something like that, gentrifying George. I think he's the one who made the comment that said Howard should move. What he will get for his home when he moves is so significantly greater. So was some wealth created? Maybe that much.
Maybe.
But not anything that's deep and lasting. And the bigger issue is that the suggestion when the neighborhood begins to change is that those of us who have been there, our culture is also supposed to disappear. We're not supposed to maintain anything that, how does somebody move into a community and ask if Howard University is a private institution? You got me on that one. So the expectation for the changes, and again, these are the structural racist implications to living in this country. And I think the fact of the matter is that we have we've got to shake up the status quo. And if that means that some folks don't move into a neighborhood or some businesses don't come into a community, that may need to be okay. Because some changes are going to have to occur so that the wealth gap does not continue to just exponentially increase.
And history is instructive.
How do you do that? Let me stop you right there, because yes, you want to, if wealth is being created, if a new dollar is being created in the economy through profit or invention or hard work, it could be, should be shared better. Let's agree on that. But how do you create mechanisms for that to happen? Can you just say, sorry, we're just staying here, and you can't have my house?
Well,
how do you
Let me give you an
break that
example. And it
cycle?
might be a small example. So the Foot Homes project has been raised. A new community, South City, is being developed, and the promise is that the people who lived in Foot Homes can come back. Okay. One of the things that is supposed to be a part of this new community is a grocery store. They cannot find a grocer who is willing to move into the neighborhood. Now, last I checked, everybody has to eat. Last I checked, it didn't matter if you were low income or high income, you had to eat. The question was posed to me, well, why are you waiting for a grocer to come in? Why doesn't somebody just start a grocery store? Now, it could be done. There are cooperative mechanisms that could be put in place. But that's the sort of thinking, I think, that's going to have to take place for us to begin, because that grocer is not going to move in until there's more development down here and more white folks come in. And then the grocery store is not going to be closer to the South City development.
Right,
it's going to be closer to where...
And so this is also an example of sort of state-sanctioned inertia, right? You know, the city will play a large role in the development of particular developments. The city will play a large role in bringing people into particular parts of town. But when it comes time to feeding people, right, then all of a sudden we're quiet, right? So my question to that, right, is who needs to be held accountable when it comes to, right, the construction of civil society? One of the things that we learned back in the 1950s and 60s in this movement is that everybody's got to be at the table. If we're going to be serious about the craft, about the role of democracy, we're going to be serious about citizenship, we're going to be serious about treating everybody equally, we hold these truths and all of that, then everybody has a role to play. And then when particular groups and particular institutions stop playing those roles, that we need to talk about that. Right? Why isn't the city that can go around and give, you know, we write checks for millions and millions and millions of dollars for all manner of things. Why isn't the city sitting down with Kroger or with another supermarket and say, hey, look, this needs to happen? Right? Has that happened? And if not, why not? Right? Like, again, so, you know, as opposed to, hey, underserved, poor black people, why don't you start a grocery store? Right? You know, I didn't have to start a grocery store in Midtown.
Right.
Right? You know, you didn't have to start a grocery store out in Germantown, right? So, you know, and so again, why are we asking the most dispossessed people in society? And this is a symptom, this is a symptom of our larger problem. And this is what we're also really good at in Memphis, right? Is acknowledging these structural barriers and then asking the people who are the victims of those structural barriers to create mechanisms to address those structural barriers.
Let me just add one thing, though. From the historic perspective, and this has nothing, I'm not arguing your point, but from a historic perspective, we actually did have our own grocery stores. Right?
We always did.
And so I'm not suggesting that maybe there shouldn't be a Kroger. I'm just suggesting that maybe we ought to say, to hell with y'all.
I think it's both and.
Right?
I think it's both and.
No, exactly.
It's both.
Exactly.
It's both and.
Exactly.
I mean, when we're the original farmers, right? I mean, you know, we know. I mean, we've always sustained and taken care of ourselves, and we have always had to do that in a white supremacist society that had us marked for death from 1619.
Right.
Right. So we've always, we've always done that. But again, and I think it's a both and. Right. We will feed ourselves, we will sustain ourselves, but let the record show that in the next zip code over, you have a different relationship with those citizens than you do with the folks in my zip code. Exactly. Let the record show, and what are we going to do about that? Who are we going to hold accountable for that? while we feed ourselves.
There's a funny set of terms we use for things that are kind of the same thing, but depending on who the beneficiary is, it gets called something different. So tax abatements, for instance, go to developers who will knock down historically low-income housing, build something where the people who used to live in those houses can't live there anymore. They don't have to pay any taxes for 15 or 30 years, but that's not called welfare. That's not called a giveaway, except by people who hate that kind of thing.
Right.
It's called community development funding.
That's
or,
right. That's right. This is a
it's
move
given
that's
some
good for
nice
everybody.
thing.
Right.
But it also is a sign of the way now government is pulling back on any explicit or implicit obligation in these areas. We're about to rev up another presidential campaign. You couldn't run for president in this country if you didn't talk about urban issues in 1960, in 1964, in 1968, in 1972. You could run for president in 2020 and not even mention the word city.
Right.
Something really changed at heart. And this is where, a big chunk of the country lives. Two of the great giants of post-war scholarship in this area, Elijah Anderson and William Julius Wilson, say, look, the civic energy just drains away and pulls back if there's an understanding that any program that's created, if any proposal that's created, heavily benefits black or brown people. Even though it may end up making everybody richer in the end, if it feels that it's for those people, the civic engagement around it, the electoral push around it, the political support, the pressure in the pipe goes away because it's for them.
But those programs are also going to help a whole bunch of low-income white folk, right? But we don't talk about that. So that's why everybody's up in arms about, the Affordable Care Act, because a whole bunch of the folks who were benefiting from it actually didn't look like me. And they're realizing now, oh my God.
Right.
What? Well, okay, we don't have to call it Obamacare. We can call it the Affordable Care Act, right?
So what's missing?
Once again.
Right. Right. So what's missing? So what's missing there? And for me, right, what's missing is a political class, right? A bipartisan political class that says, look, you know what? If we don't do these things, we are all diminished, right?
Right.
But there is political hay to be made by demonizing Obamacare, so that you've got coal miners in West Virginia who are dying of black lung, literally, who want to get rid of Obamacare, which is the piece of legislation that says if you die of black lung, your wife gets your benefits.
Right.
And they're like, well, I don't want that. I don't want that. And then when you tell them, you know what, that gets rid of your black lung benefit, they'll, oh, well, wait a minute. No, I didn't mean that part. Right? So one of the things that we're missing now is a political class that has the courage. And we haven't seen this courage in 40 years, right? A political class that says, you know what? Racism will kill us all if we're not careful, if we're not mindful of this. Right? The ways in which we diminish particular groups of people, right, is going to be the death knell for all of us, unless we make a course correction, right? And we're lacking, and we're not in a moment where we see that type of I think we're lacking in terms of seeing that type of political leadership on the top, which is so important, which is why folk here in this room and in this city and in this county have to start organizing, right, so that we can generate the energy and the pressure to encourage our elected officials to have the type of vision and leadership that we need. So there's a symbiotic relationship there between our organizing on the ground and people having the courage to make the right call.
We're getting toward the end of our time. I need to hear some more suggestions, practical suggestions about how to disrupt some of the syndromes that you've so well described during the earlier part of the conversation.
Well, I would just say that this place, the museum actually documents all sorts of strategies for organizing, right? And one of the most effective strategies that was used was boycott. And it's something that we very rarely see used nowadays. But it's a very effective mechanism that can be used, but we got to figure out what we're going to use it for, right? The other thing, and this is not practical, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that I'm not so certain that this two-party system that we've had forever any longer benefits us, right? And like anything, things change. And it may be time for us to reconsider this two-party system that we call, government.
Really quickly, one of the things I tell my students constantly when I'm teaching my civil rights class is Martin Luther King did not write a letter from a Birmingham country club.
Right.
He did not write the letter from the Birmingham Civic, Chamber of Commerce. Right? He was in jail. It's a letter from a Birmingham jail, and because he got put in jail because he went to Birmingham to shut Birmingham down. Because Birmingham was engaged in violent, virulent, white supremacist behavior, sanctioned by law. Right? So we've got a model of what needs to happen. What we need to do is to start shutting stuff down. And I don't know if that's practical or impractical, but that's what worked in the past, right? We have to start holding people accountable, and we have to start engaging in the type of organizing that brings people not only to political meetings and political conventions. We're getting ready to have a people's convention here, Up the Vote. Shout out to Up the Vote. We're getting ready to have a people's convention here politically. So we need to start organizing in a way that not only brings people into the political process, but also brings people out into the streets in protest.
Please thank Charles McKinney and Terri Freeman.